The winter sky over northern Germany was the color of tarnished silver. Clouds hung low, thick as wool, their undersides bruised with shadow. Far below them stretched a landscape half buried in snow, small towns like quiet smudges of smoke, winding rivers locked beneath sheets of ice, forests of black pines standing motionless against the wind. It was December 20th, 1943. A day like so many others in that long, grinding war, yet one that would linger in history, not for destruction, but for an unexpected act of mercy. Somewhere above those clouds, a formation of B-17 bombers droned steadily toward Bremen. Their engines, 1,200 revolutions of iron and fury, thrummed like a heartbeat across the sky. The lead ship, nicknamed the Old Pub, was young, its crew even younger. Lieutenant Charlie, Brown, a 21-year-old American pilot from West Virginia, sat at the controls, his gloved hands steady despite the cold biting through the seams of his flight jacket. It was only his second combat mission. He had never seen death close enough to recognize its breath. Inside the bomber, the men worked in quiet rhythm, checking gauges, watching for fighters, murmuring to each other over the intercom in clipped, routine sentences. The sound of the engines was constant, a kind of mechanical lullaby that dulled the nerves while sharpening the mind. Below them, the target city lay hidden beneath its winter coat, waiting. Far to the east, at a small Luftwaffe base near Oldenburg, another pilot prepared for flight. Franz Stigler, older, 28, a veteran of Africa and Sicily, tightened his gloves as ground crew fueled his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was a man carved by years of combat, his face lean, his eyes pale and watchful. To him, flying was second nature, a language he spoke fluently with throttle, rudder, and instinct. He had lost too many friends, seen too many men vanish into smoke. That morning, his orders were simple: intercept the incoming bombers. But for Stigler, the war had changed. The skies no longer felt like glory, only endurance. He still followed orders, still did his duty, but a small, quiet part of him longed for something beyond survival. For the sound of home, perhaps, or simply for the silence that followed when engines stopped. By midday, the two men were fated to meet. As the Old Pub neared Bremen, anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground, black puffs of flak blossoming around the formation. Shrapnel tore through aluminum and flesh alike. Brown's bomber shuddered violently, one engine catching fire. The intercom filled with shouting. "Number 2's gone! She's burning! Hydraulics failing! We're hit in the tail!" Still, they pressed on. Bombs away. A thunderous release. The payload dropped, the earth below erupting in dull orange flashes. Mission complete, but at a cost. Turning for home, the pub limped behind the others, slower, heavier, bleeding smoke. It was then that the Luftwaffe launched. Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt streaked upward through the clouds, sunlight glinting off its sleek, pale green fuselage. He spotted the crippled bomber at once, trailing alone, its formation far ahead. Easy prey. His heart tightened with the old rhythm of battle. Throttle forward. Guns armed. He climbed higher, circling around for the perfect angle. As he approached, the damage became clear. The tail was shredded. One engine was dead. The nose gunner's glass was shattered. Through the holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see the men inside, wounded, slumped, blood on the walls. Yet the plane kept flying, stubbornly holding course toward the North Sea. He steadied his gun sight on the cockpit. One burst, and it would be over. But his finger froze. He could see the pilot now, a boy, barely more than 20, his face pale, eyes fixed forward. There was no threat, no defiance, just exhaustion. Around him, the crew struggled to tend to the wounded, using scarves as bandages, hands trembling in the cold. For a moment, Stigler hesitated, a single breath suspended in time, as if the war itself had paused to watch what he would do next. He remembered something his old commanding officer, Gustav Rodel, had told him years before. "You are a fighter pilot, Franz, not a murderer. If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." The words echoed in the silence between gunfire and wind. Stigler eased off the trigger. He drew closer instead, flying alongside the battered bomber, matching its speed. Inside ye old pub, the American crew saw him appear, sleek, predatory, death itself painted in gray and crosses. Panic filled the intercom. "He's right beside us! He's lining up!" But the German did not fire. Instead, he nodded once, a small, almost human gesture through the canopy glass. And so began one of the strangest friendships in the history of war. The frozen air between their planes held its breath. The hunter and the hunted, side by side, flying together through a sky that knew only enemies. The hunter and the hunted, side by side. It is hard to imagine two men born further apart in circumstance yet drawn together by the strange geometry of war. One came from the rolling hills of America, a land untouched by bombing raids or ration cards. The other, from the quiet heart of Bavaria, where the war had already taken fathers, brothers, and sons. Lieutenant Charlie Brown had grown up in a small West Virginian town where church bells marked the hours and trains sang down in the valley. He learned to fly at a dusty airfield on weekends, when fuel was still cheap and skies were unscarred. Flying had always felt to him like a promise, of freedom, of height, of distance from the world's troubles. When war came, he answered without hesitation, his mother pressing a cross into his palm as he left for training. In the air, Brown was steady and precise. He had none of the swagger some bomber pilots were known for. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who preferred to fix a loose rivet himself rather than order someone else to do it. On missions, his crew respected him for his calm. He wasn't the type to shout over the intercom. He spoke slowly, evenly, his voice a thread of steadiness when flack and fear filled the cabin. Thousands of miles away, in another lifetime almost, Franz Stigler had learned to fly for entirely different reasons. He was born in a Catholic family in Regensburg, the son of an airplane mechanic. The scent of oil and metal was as familiar to him as bread. Before the war, he had flown commercial planes for Lufthansa, polished silver birds carrying passengers across peaceful skies. His first taste of combat came not from hatred but from a sense of duty, to defend his homeland, to protect the skies he loved. But duty, he soon discovered, carried a heavy cost. By 1943, he had seen squadrons decimated, his closest friends vanishing in fire. The Luftwaffe was changing too, once a fraternity of pilots bound by honor, now a machine of desperation. Franz flew because it was all he knew how to do. He clung to the code his instructor had drilled into him. Fight with skill, fight with courage, but never lose your humanity. On that December day, those two worlds collided, one of youthful resolve, the other of weary honor. Charlie Brown, in his wounded B-17, wrestled the controls, trying to coax his aircraft toward home. Blood streaked the floor. The tail gunner lay still. Oxygen was running low, and ice crept across the instruments like frost on a windowpane. His co-pilot muttered prayers. Yet, through the noise, Brown kept his focus. He had men depending on him. He could not give in to fear. High above and behind, Franz Stigler studied the bomber through his canopy. He could see every bullet hole, every trembling vibration of metal trying to stay airborne. To finish it now would be simple, one burst of 20mm cannon fire. The rules of war would even commend it. But something inside him rebelled. This was not combat, it was execution. He edged his Messerschmitt closer, close enough to see faces behind the glass. One of the gunners stared back at him with eyes wide as moons. Stigler gestured, first with his hand, then with his wings, trying to signal for them to turn towards Sweden, to land and surrender. But the Americans, stunned and half-blind with frost, didn't understand. For a long, delicate minute the two aircraft hung there, enemies, mirrored in flight, moving through air that seemed too thin to hold such contradiction. The bomber's engines coughed, black smoke trailing behind. The Germans' propeller gleamed in the weak winter sun. They were, in every sense, alone in the sky, beyond orders, beyond reason, beyond the reach of the war machine below. Stigler made a decision. If they could not understand his signal, he would protect them. He throttled back, slipping beside the B-17's wing like a shepherd guiding a wounded animal. Together they moved northward, toward the North Sea, away from the city still burning beneath them. Inside ye old pub, Brown's crew could scarcely believe it. "He's covering us?" someone whispered. The German plane flew formation with them, its guns pointed harmlessly to the horizon. Each man on board felt an odd, almost reverent silence settle over the cabin. Below, German anti-aircraft batteries spotted the pair but held fire, the sight too confusing, too strange. An American bomber and a Luftwaffe fighter flying side by side like companions. No one could explain it then. Perhaps no one can even now. But in that gray December air, something fragile and miraculous took shape, a truce born not of treaties, but of simple human recognition. And as the two planes carved their path through the clouds, the line between friend and enemy grew thin, dissolving like smoke in the wind. The roar of the engine softened into a trembling hum, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Charlie Brown's hands were numb on the controls, his gloves stiff with frozen sweat. Every few seconds he stole a glance out the window, half expecting the German fighter to veer away and open fire. But it didn't. The Messerschmitt simply floated beside them, steady as a companion, its pilot watching in silence. Inside the bomber, the crew was restless. "Is he waiting to finish us off? Maybe he's playing with us." Brown didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, not from fear, but disbelief. He'd been taught that mercy was a rare luxury in the sky. You saw the enemy, you shot first. That was survival. But now, staring across a few dozen yards of freezing air, he saw a man, just a man, flying alongside them with a strange expression that looked more like sorrow than hatred. Through the frosted glass, Stigler could see the young faces, the pale, exhausted expressions of men who had seen too much for their age. He could make out the jagged holes in the fuselage, the shattered tail, the torn fabric fluttering like prayer flags. One more hit and the bomber would tumble from the sky. He thought of his own brother, lost early in the war, and something inside him broke. He remembered his commander's voice from training. "If I ever hear that you shot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. You fight to protect honor, not to murder." That sentence echoed now in the cockpit. Franz loosened his grip on the trigger and exhaled a long, shaky breath. He tilted his plane slightly, bringing himself closer, close enough that the two aircraft seemed almost tethered by an invisible thread. The American pilot's eyes widened as the German saluted, two fingers raised to his temple in a gesture of respect. Inside the B-17, the co-pilot whispered, "He's saluting us?" Brown just nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Stigler motioned again, pointing down and toward the east, toward Sweden, where neutral territory offered safety. The Americans didn't respond. Brown's only thought was to get back to England, to bring his crew home, even if it meant crossing half of occupied Europe with a broken tail and a dying engine. And so he kept flying west. For a moment, Stigler was torn between duty and conscience. If he let them go, he risked court-martial or worse. To escort the enemy over German lines without firing was to defy the Reich itself. But he couldn't bring himself to destroy them, not like this. Not when mercy felt so painfully right. Down below, German gunners tracked their movement. Through binoculars, the sight was incomprehensible. A German fighter shadowing an American bomber, flying together, as if sharing the same mission. The flak crews hesitated, unsure whether to fire. One misjudgment could mean hitting their own pilot. So they waited, holding their fire as the two aircraft slipped by. At 10,000 feet, clouds gathered like smoke, wrapping the plains in gray silk. Brown leaned forward, squinting into the mist. He could no longer see the ground, only the faint outline of the Messerschmitt keeping pace beside him. A part of him began to wonder if it was real at all, or if exhaustion and blood loss had conjured an illusion of compassion. But then, through the frost and haze, he saw it again, the salute. A final, deliberate motion. Then, slowly, gracefully, the German banked away. Franz Stigler peeled off to the right, descending slightly. His plane shimmered in the pale winter sun before dissolving into the horizon. The silence that followed was immense, almost holy. Brown watched him go until the last speck of gray vanished. In that instant, he felt the strangest mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, and an aching sadness. He had just witnessed something rare, something that didn't belong in the vocabulary of war. The enemy had spared him, not because of orders or strategy, but because one man recognized another's humanity. The B-17 limped on, its engines coughing like tired lungs. Below them stretched the cold expanse of the North Sea. The bomber's crew, wounded, half-conscious, barely alive, began to murmur prayers. And above it all, Brown's mind returned to that silent salute, repeating it again and again in the dim theater of memory. For a brief moment, amid the ruin of war, two enemies had shared the same sky, and left it unbroken. The Messerschmitt was gone, swallowed by the gray sea of cloud, leaving behind nothing but the hum of dying engines and the ghost of a salute. For a long time, no one inside ye old pub spoke. Words felt too small for what had just happened. They had stared at death, and death had blinked. Charlie Brown sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white on the yoke. He was exhausted, but he couldn't let go. The bomber shuddered like an animal on its last breath, each vibration sending a low groan through the fuselage. Below, the endless North Sea stretched, cold and unforgiving, ready to claim any mistake. The tail section was nearly gone. Wind howled through the openings where metal had once been. The intercom sputtered, the oxygen lines hissed, and the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with blood. Every few minutes, Brown checked on his men. Some were unconscious, others murmured softly, drifting in and out of awareness. The youngest, Sergeant Gillesco, kept whispering, "Did that really happen? Did a German just help us?" Brown nodded without turning around. "Yeah," he said. "He did." The engines coughed again, louder this time. He tapped the gauges. Fuel was low, dangerously low. The navigator leaned forward, voice trembling. "We'll never make it to base." Brown's reply came in a whisper. "We'll try anyway." The world outside was nothing but gray, the kind of colorless air that made you lose all sense of direction. The horizon vanished. The sea and sky became one. Brown's mind began to drift back to the German pilot's face, calm and watchful, lit by winter light. He wondered what drove him to mercy. Was it pity? Conscience? Or something simpler, recognition, perhaps, that war was not worth another ghost in the clouds? Every few minutes, Brown thought he saw movement outside, a shadow, a glint of silver, and half expected the Messerschmitt to return. But the sky remained empty, save for the rhythmic heartbeat of the propellers. As the hours dragged on, the bomber sank lower. Ice gathered on the wings, dragging them down like invisible weights. The radio operator tried sending a distress call, but the transmitter was half dead. Static hissed, then silence. The only sound was the wheezing of the engines and the wind clawing at the fuselage. At last, through the mist, a faint outline appeared, England's coast. The crew barely believed it. Tears welled in eyes that had forgotten how to cry. The navigator let out a hoarse laugh that broke into coughing. "We made it," he gasped. "God, we actually made it." But even then, the danger wasn't over. The landing gear refused to lower, jammed from the damage. The co-pilot suggested bailing out, but Brown shook his head. "No one bails," he said quietly. "We land together, or we don't land at all." The bomber staggered toward the nearest airfield, trailing smoke. Fire trucks waited below, their sirens faint in the distance. Brown lined up the approach, sweat freezing on his brow. The plane dipped once, twice. The nose tilted. Then, with a groan that seemed to echo from the earth itself, ye old pub slammed into the runway and skidded across it, sparks flashing from the torn metal belly. The plane slid to a stop in a trail of smoke and silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, the crew stirred. Every man alive. Bruised, bloodied, but alive. Charlie Brown climbed out last, stepping into the cold air that smelled faintly of oil and snow. Around him, medics rushed forward, shouting, pointing, asking questions. But his mind was somewhere else, still in that gray sky above Germany, replaying that single, impossible gesture. He turned east, toward the horizon he had escaped. The clouds hung heavy, soft and dim. Somewhere beyond them, a German pilot was flying home too. Brown raised a hand, almost without thinking, and saluted the empty air. That night, when officials questioned him about the mission, he hesitated before speaking. They asked how his bomber survived. He said, "We were lucky." He did not mention the Messerschmitt. Not yet. There were things the war wouldn't believe, acts too human to fit inside its logic. And so, the story stayed locked behind tired eyes for years. But sometimes, when the wind outside his window howled just right, Charlie swore he could still hear that second engine beside his own, the quiet promise of mercy at 10,000 feet. The debriefing room was too bright, too clean. The hum of fluorescent lights felt unnatural after the chaos of flight. Charlie Brown sat at a metal table, a cup of untouched coffee steaming beside a pile of papers he could barely focus on. His hands still trembled, not from fear now, but from the memory of quiet, that impossible, wordless moment when an enemy had chosen not to kill him. The officers across the table exchanged looks as they spoke. "You mean a German fighter escorted you out of their airspace?" Brown hesitated. "Not escorted. More like shadowed us." "Did he fire?" "No." "Then why didn't you shoot him down?" He looked up slowly. "Because he didn't try to kill us." "He could have." "And he didn't." The room went silent. One officer coughed, another wrote something down without meeting his eyes. Eventually they dismissed him, with instructions to keep the details vague in your official report. Acts of mercy, it seemed, had no place in the machinery of war. When Brown finally stepped outside, the English air was damp and heavy. The base was quiet, except for the occasional echo of engines overhead. He lit a cigarette, though his hands shook so badly he could barely hold it. Each drag burned sharp in his throat. He stared at the clouds, wondering where the German was now. Was he alive? Was he being praised for mercy or punished for it? The next morning, Brown visited his crew in the medical tent. The men were bandaged and pale, some still dazed from shock. The youngest, Yalesko, grinned weakly when he saw him. "Sir," he whispered, "that German, think he made it home too?" Brown smiled faintly. I hope so. It was all he could say. As the days passed, the mission became legend among the bomber crews, though not officially. In whispered retellings, the story changed shape. Some said the German was a ghost, others that he had been ordered to escort them for interrogation. But Brown knew better. He had seen the eyes behind the canopy, the salute, the slow roll away into mist. It was no ghost. It was a man. War carried on. Missions followed missions. The skies over Europe filled with new planes, new losses, new smoke. But something in Brown's heart had shifted. Each time he took off after that, he couldn't bring himself to hate the shapes rising to meet him. He aimed, he fired when ordered, but never with the same conviction. The face of the German lingered, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. In moments of stillness, when the engines droned softly and the world below shrank to nothing, he would think, "We were both soldiers, both trapped in the same madness, both just trying to survive it without losing our souls." By 1945, when the war finally cracked open and began to crumble, Brown was a changed man. He returned home to West Virginia a hero by every visible measure. But inside, he carried a quiet weight, the unspoken gratitude to a stranger who had chosen mercy over victory. Years passed. He built a family, a home, a life filled with ordinary days. He worked in aviation, still flying now and then, though never with the same hunger as before. He found peace in routine, morning coffee, newspapers, the sound of rain against his window. But every winter, when frost traced the glass and fog rolled in from the hills, the memory returned. The gray sky. The broken bomber. The German salute. For decades, he wondered what had become of that pilot. Did he survive the war? Did he remember the American plane he'd spared? Brown sometimes thought of writing to veteran associations, of searching through records. But something always stopped him. A quiet fear that maybe the man hadn't made it, or worse, that the world had forgotten him. Still, the need to know grew stronger with time. By the late 1980s, when age had softened the edges of memory but not the ache of it, Charlie decided that silence had lasted long enough. "If he's alive," he told himself one winter morning, "I owe him a thank you that's 40 years late." And so began a search that would cross oceans, decades, and the delicate boundary between enemies turned kindred. By the time Charlie Brown began his search, the war had been over for more than 4 decades. The world had moved on, cities rebuilt, generations born into peace, and history turned into pages in textbooks. But for Brown, there was still a thread left untied, one that stretched from the freezing skies of Germany in 1943 to his quiet living room in Florida. He had grown old gracefully, silver hair, steady eyes, a kind voice that still carried the authority of a man who once commanded men through fire. But beneath that calm, he carried an unanswered question: who was the German pilot who spared me? For years he had tried to forget. Life had demanded other duties: marriage, children, work. But every now and then, he would find himself staring out the window at clouds drifting above the horizon, and the memory would surface with startling clarity. The eyes behind the canopy. The hand raised in salute. He couldn't let it rest anymore. So, in 1988, at the age of 66, Charlie sat down at his desk with a pen and a half-empty mug of coffee. He began to write letters, dozens of them, to Luftwaffe veterans associations, aviation museums, and historical societies across Germany. Each letter was polite, careful, and sincere. On December 20th, 1943, he wrote, "I was the pilot of a B-17 bomber returning from a mission over Bremen. Our aircraft was severely damaged, and a German fighter pilot spared us when he could have destroyed us easily. I've never forgotten him. I would like to find him if he is still alive." Weeks passed. Then months. For a long time, there was silence, until one morning, a letter arrived from Germany. The handwriting was neat, the ink blue and deliberate. Inside, a man named Johannes Steinhoff, a former Luftwaffe commander, expressed curiosity and sympathy. He didn't know who the pilot might have been, but he promised to circulate Brown's story among veteran groups. More months passed. Winter came and went. Brown began to think perhaps it was hopeless. Too much time had gone by, too many memories lost to the years. Then, in early 1990, a letter arrived that made his hands tremble as he opened it. The letter was from a man named Franz Stigler, living quietly in Vancouver, Canada. Dear Mr. Brown, it began. I was a pilot with Jagerschwader 27. On December 20th, 1943, I encountered AB-17 returning from Bremen, heavily damaged. I did not fire. Instead, I flew beside it until it reached the coast. Could it be that this was your plane? Brown read those lines again and again, his eyes misting. He didn't need photographs or proof. He knew. He knew instantly. He called his wife into the room, his voice shaking. I found him, he said. After all these years. I found him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He thought about what to write back. How could he possibly thank a man for a gift like life? The right words felt too small. Eventually, he simply wrote. It was me. I was that pilot. You saved my crew and me. After 46 years, I can finally say thank you. Over the next weeks, their letters flowed like water long dammed. They exchanged photographs. Brown with his wife and grandchildren, Stigler beside his small aircraft, silver hair swept back, the same steady eyes that once peered across the gun sight of a Messerschmitt. Franz told him about his life after the war, how he'd emigrated to Canada, started a business, and avoided talking about the war for decades. He confessed that he had often wondered what became of the American bomber he'd spared. I thought perhaps you had crashed into the sea, he wrote. To know that you lived, that is the best news I have ever received. The two men, now both old, shared the same strange bond, a single encounter that had defined their lives in opposite uniforms. And so, after months of letters, came the inevitable moment, the plan to meet. In June 1990, in a small hall in Washington state, two gray-haired men stood facing each other across a crowd of reporters, veterans, and family. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Then Brown stepped forward and embraced Franz tightly. There were no words at first, only the sound of applause, and the quiet sobs of men who had long forgotten what forgiveness looked like. I love you, my brother, Brown whispered. I love you too, Franz replied. It was not the language of soldiers. It was the language of survivors, of two men who had refused, on a cold day in 1943, to let war have the last word. The hall was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional cough. Photographers clicked from the edges, but for Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, the world had narrowed to a single point, the man who had once shared the sky with him. When they embraced, it was not just a handshake of courtesy or the polite nods of old acquaintances. It was a collision of decades of memory, fear, gratitude, relief, and the quiet shame of survival. Tears rolled down their weathered faces, lines carved by age and time, as though each wrinkle had been waiting for this reunion. They stepped apart slightly, finally meeting eyes. The audience could feel the tension in the air, the weight of history condensed into a single gaze. Brown spoke first, his voice gentle, almost a whisper. 46 years. I never forgot you. Franz replied with equal calm. Nor I you. I thought often of that bomber, wondering if I had done right. Now I know I did. The world outside the hall had changed, and so had the men within it. Yet for that brief moment, time seemed to fold back, taking them to the gray, frigid skies of December 1943. They could almost feel the roar of engines, the bite of frost, the shuddering of metal and fear. Only now, the fear had transformed into gratitude, the roar into quiet laughter, the cold into warmth. News of their reunion traveled quickly. Newspapers wrote of the extraordinary story, a German and an American, enemies once, bound by mercy, meeting nearly half a century later. Aviation historians were fascinated, documenting the incident as a rare act of humanity in a war often defined by death. Veterans wrote letters, sharing their own memories of similar, fleeting mercies. Students in classrooms across the world learned that sometimes courage was not in the guns or bombs, but in restraint. For Brown and Stigler, the attention was secondary. They cared little for fame or recognition. Their joy lay in simple things, talking late into the evening about that flight, exchanging photographs and letters, and most of all, laughing over the shared memory of being young, terrified, and yet somehow profoundly human. Franz would describe the moment in letters later. "I have never regretted my choice. Every day, I live with the memory of that flight, not as a moment of shame or fear, but as proof that one man can choose kindness, even when the world demands cruelty." Brown, in turn, would say, "That day taught me something the war could never teach, that survival is not just about skill, but about recognizing the soul of another human being, even when they wear the uniform of an enemy." Together they began to speak publicly, but softly, gentle talks at veteran gatherings, interviews where their voices were calm, measured, almost hypnotic. They spoke of mercy, of courage, and of the strange companionship of two men who had shared the sky for a single, miraculous flight. It was not a story of victory in war. It was a story of victory over war itself, a quiet triumph of conscience and compassion that transcended borders, time, and even decades of enmity. In a world that had long forgotten the faces behind the planes, these two men reminded everyone that courage sometimes comes not from the battlefield, but from a single, human choice to spare a life. And in that quiet hall, surrounded by applause and cameras, they shared a knowing glance, the kind that only those who have faced death together can share, and for a moment, the world outside fell away, leaving only two old pilots, side by side, finally at peace. After the reunion, life returned to a steady rhythm for both men, yet neither could shake the lessons of that extraordinary flight. The war was long over, and the skies had grown quiet, but in their hearts, the memory lingered like an echo, persistent, gentle, and instructive. For Charlie Brown, the experience became a quiet compass for his remaining years. He lived with a deep, abiding awareness of human fragility and the power of small choices. Each morning, he would sip his coffee, gaze at the clouds, and recall the German pilot who had spared them. That single decision, a refusal to fire, had altered the course of not only his life, but the lives of every man aboard ye old pub. Brown carried the lesson into every interaction. In his family, he was patient, calm, and attentive, teaching his children and grandchildren that courage often hides in restraint, that mercy can be as heroic as action. In his community, he quietly volunteered, helped neighbors, and shared stories not of battle, but of empathy and the shared humanity that war could never erase. Franz Stigler, too, carried the memory with a quiet reverence. In Canada, he built a life devoted to peace, avoiding conversations of combat unless necessary, yet speaking often about the moral responsibilities of power. He never regretted sparing the Americans, though he sometimes wondered if others would have understood his choice in the midst of war. Eventually, the reunion confirmed what he had always suspected, that even amidst chaos, compassion has enduring power. Both men became, in their later years, subtle emissaries of peace. They gave interviews, attended veteran meetings, and spoke at aviation museums, always in the calm, measured tone that mirrored the skies of their encounter. They emphasized not heroism in violence, but heroism in humanity. Their story inspired pilots, historians, and ordinary people alike, proving that even in the deadliest moments, conscience can prevail. Yet perhaps the most profound lessons were personal. Both men learned that life is fragile, fleeting, and often dictated by chance. The bomber could have crashed. The Messerschmitt could have fired. Each had walked on the edge of death and returned. That awareness fostered humility, patience, and a deep respect for others' lives. Friends and families noticed subtle changes in their behavior. Brown's children often recalled him pausing during walks to admire a bird in flight, or speaking softly to strangers as if acknowledging the invisible weight they carried. Stigler's neighbors would mention how he seemed to notice small acts of kindness, valuing them with a sincerity uncommon in the world. Even historians studying World War II took note. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler was frequently cited as an example of moral courage in extreme conditions, a reminder that acts of humanity can survive amid devastation. Some argued it was a singular event, too rare to influence the course of war, yet those who understood its subtle impact knew it had shaped the lives of two men for decades, rippling outward into families, communities, and hearts across continents. And in quiet moments, both men reflected on the same truth, that the sky had once offered them a choice, to kill or to spare, to obey orders or to follow conscience. They chose mercy, and it had carried them through the rest of their lives, whispering lessons in patience, courage, and empathy with every cloud and gust of wind. Sometimes they would smile knowingly at each other, decades later, understanding that the greatest victories of war are not counted in bullets or medals, but in the quiet, steadfast choices that honor life itself. In the years that followed, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became unlikely mentors, their extraordinary story evolving into a lesson far larger than themselves. They traveled to schools, community halls, and veteran gatherings, speaking in calm, measured tones, their voices almost hypnotic in their steadiness. They never sought applause or accolades. Their aim was simply to share a truth that transcended uniform, nationality, or conflict: mercy matters. Children listened, rapt, as the two men described that gray December sky, the hum of engines, and the frozen air that carried both danger and possibility. Teachers noticed how the story made young minds pause, imagining not only the tension of combat but the rare, almost miraculous choice to spare life. History, they said, is not only about battles won or lost. It's about what people do in those moments no one else watches. Veterans, too, found themselves moved. Many had witnessed acts of mercy in their own wartime experience, fleeting glimpses of humanity amidst chaos, and Brown and Stigler's story gave those memories voice. The tale became a bridge, linking generations of soldiers and civilians alike, reminding them that even in war, kindness is a currency more valuable than medals. Over decades, the story traveled further. Historians documented it carefully, ensuring accuracy, capturing letters, photographs, and interviews. Documentaries brought their calm voices to millions, narrating not explosions or dogfights, but the quiet courage of restraint. Libraries housed accounts of the encounter. Museums displayed photos of the men, side by side in old age, and the battered bomber that survived against all odds. For Brown and Stigler, the story was never about fame. It was about memory, respect, and legacy. They wrote letters to each other well into their 80s, reflecting on small details of that flight: the way ice clung to the B-17's wings, the sound of wind rushing through torn metal, the faint salute exchanged above the clouds. Every recollection was a thread weaving together two lives that war had tried to divide. Families became part of the narrative. Brown's grandchildren marveled at the idea that their grandfather owed his life to an enemy pilot whose conscience outweighed his orders. They listened with wide eyes to Franz's letters describing the moral calculations of a young German soldier. Together, the families celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet holidays, finding in each other's presence a human connection born from a shared moment decades earlier. Even as they aged, both men retained a surprising vitality in spirit. The world outside changed rapidly. Planes grew faster, wars more complex, technology more distant from the visceral, open-sky battles they had known. Yet in their minds, the skies of December 1943 remained clear, carrying the memory of one decision that had altered not just their lives, but the lives of countless others who learned of it. In classrooms, history books, and lectures, the lesson endured: courage is not only measured by what you destroy, but by what you choose to protect. Brown and Stigler's story became a quiet anthem of conscience, whispered across time to anyone willing to listen, a reminder that even in the most violent of human endeavors, the soul has room to act with grace. And so the two men, once enemies in the skies, grew old together in spirit, connected by memory, choice, and the silent understanding that mercy can be the most powerful weapon of all. Decades had passed since that gray December morning over Germany. The world had changed, cities rebuilt, wars faded into history, generations born and grown, but the memory of that flight remained vivid for both Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler. It was not just a memory, it was a compass, guiding their lives with quiet insistence, a reminder that even in the darkest skies, humanity could shine. Charlie, now in his late 70s, sat on the porch of his Florida home, the afternoon sun warm on his shoulders. He thought of Franz often, even though the letters were fewer now, each delayed by age or health. Sometimes he would gaze up at the clouds, tracing invisible lines, imagining the Messerschmitt still flying beside his old bomber. And always he remembered that salute, a gesture small yet immeasurably powerful. Franz, meanwhile, lived quietly in Vancouver, his hands steady, his heart gentle. He tended his garden, watched birds, and reflected on a life that had been both ordinary and extraordinary. The war had taken much, but it had also offered a strange gift: the chance to witness mercy, to choose it, and to know its enduring power. In interviews, documentaries, and family gatherings, the story was told again and again, but both men knew that no recording could capture the weight of that moment: the frozen air, the trembling fuselage, the choice that defied orders and expectations. The true gravity of the encounter lived only in memory, a sacred space shared between two men across continents and decades. As they aged, the two men sometimes imagined meeting one final time. Perhaps it would be in a quiet park, beside a lake, or in the soft hush of a winter morning, where conversation would not be interrupted by cameras or crowds. They would speak of nothing and everything, of the war, of families, of the peculiar joy of surviving when so many had not. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would share a silent salute once more, not to the past, but to the enduring lesson it carried. For both Charlie and Franz, life became a series of gentle reflections, each day a gift, each sunrise a reminder of that one fragile act of humanity in the skies. They found joy in the ordinary: grandchildren's laughter, quiet walks, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of planes in the sky, yet beneath it all ran the deep, steady current of memory, mercy, courage, and the quiet power of conscience. And so the story rests not in the history books alone, but in the quiet hearts of all who hear it: a German and an American, enemies by circumstance, bound by a single, impossible act of kindness. A testament that even in war, one man can choose humanity, and that choice can ripple outward through time, touching lives long after the guns have fallen silent. The skies may have been gray, the engines loud, the war unrelenting. But on one cold December day, two men shared the same air, and in that shared space, humanity won. And in that victory, the world became, if only for a moment, a little softer, a little brighter, and infinitely more humane.